Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits and I have updates on 3 of my Finish It February projects. So let's get started. This tidbit came to me, I don't know, in my social media feed. I'm not even sure where it came from. It is an article in the BBC. I'll leave a link down below. And it's on the Bayeux Tapestry. It's a woman named Mia Hansen. She's Swedish, but she lives in England. She has, for the past 6 years, been working on creating an actual full-size replica of the Bayeux Tapestry. So this tapestry, the original one, is like 950 years old. It's amazing that any piece of textile has lasted this long, never mind one that is 230 feet long. They believe that it was a work that was commissioned by Odo, who was the half-brother of William the Conqueror. And some of the scenes in there do depict the Norman conquest. And so they believe, and based on where it was originally hung and some of the people who are depicted in it, they believe that's the origin of why this work came to be. And likely dozens of people were working on it. It's an embroidery. They call it a tapestry. And technically, tapestry is supposed to mean like this tapestry weaving technique. They do call this a tapestry, but it is embroidered. So this woman in England, her name's Mia Hansen, she has been working on this 6 years, and she said one of the challenging things about this is, looking at it in such detail and then recreating it. She sees all of the mistakes, and then she has to replicate them in order for it to be an actual replica. So there's like a person there, for example, that has 2 right hands, like the thumb of the left hand is on the wrong side of the hand, and she's replicating it. So to me, it would be interesting to know if she has introduced any of her own errors unknowingly into the replica. But I will leave links to the article about her, but also I'm going to leave a link to the Bayeux Museum, and you can learn more about it. You can see all of the entire tapestry. You can look at the different panels and see what they look like. It's just an amazing piece of work to believe that it has lasted this many centuries. This tidbit came to me from Ollie Jones on Instagram. Ollie has sent me links to various tidbits in the past that I've shared with you, so I always appreciate that because they're always things I haven't seen before and that are incredibly interesting. So this is basically a course on the history of craft that's being offered by another person on Instagram, whose Instagram account is called Rare Device. So what I'm going to leave a link to is Rare Device's link tree, where you can find the links to all of the things I'm going to be talking about. So it's this course, and she's going to be using a variety of things. She's going to be using Instagram stories, which she will be saving to her saved stories. But she's got a whole Google Drive full of different articles, readings. She's got a syllabus, and she's going through the entire, all different kinds of crafts. She's, first of all, defining, what is craft. But Unit 1, which is going on right now, is on fiber. But there are going to be some other crafts, obviously. There's going to be ceramics, wood, metal, glass, but other topics that are related to more crafts in general. But it's really interesting. Look at the syllabus. You can see what the readings are. You could follow along as she also has blog postings and Instagram stories. But thank you, Ollie, for alerting us to this because this sounds really fascinating. If you've been following me for a while, you will know that not only do I have a deep interest in knitting and knitting history, but also other textile crafts. And that in the past few years, as I've learned more and more about spinning and the Industrial Revolution, I've just become so fascinated by how important textiles are to us as human beings. So Yin Yang Knitter, who sends me links pretty often as well, sent me a link to a blog post by a woman, Anne Kingstone. And the blog post is called From a Yorkshire Cottage. And so she was talking about doing her own family history research and how they had gotten stuck at a particular great-grandfather, like sixth great-grandfather or something, who was a butcher. And she and her sister decided to go and do some research in person and look at parish records, and they were able to trace their family much further back. And once they just went back one additional generation, they started finding all of these ancestors who were involved in the textile industry. And a lot of this was prior to the Industrial Revolution. So these were cottage industries where people were weaving at home or spinning at home, taking their cloth to the market and selling it there. And so this has been really interesting to me because the Richardson immigrants in my family are some of the most recent immigrants to this country. They came in about the mid-19th century from North Yorkshire, but they were all farmers. And as I looked at family members and tracked those people down, some of them got involved in the coal industry, but I never found anybody involved in the textile industry. But this past fall, when my daughter and her partner were here in the country visiting, I had been doing his family history off and on as he'd been giving me more details. And while he was here, he was finding out more information from his mother and then passing it along to me, and I was tracking his family. So he's from Northern England as well, but he's got a lot of semen on his tree, which is exciting to me because of the idea of somebody in his family maybe wearing a fisherman's gansey at some point. But he also has a lot of family members who were in the textile industry. And it's been so much fun looking at those census records and finding the jobs that men and women were doing during the Industrial Revolution. So I haven't gone any further back in his tree, but this is really interesting, this blog post of this woman who has, visiting these different buildings that are still standing and learning more about the textile industry prior to the Industrial Revolution. So if that is something that sounds interesting to you, I will leave a link, obviously, down in the show notes. So this tidbit showed up on my Twitter feed, and it is an article about wool smuggling, medieval wool smuggling. It's a blog post by a man named Matt Raven from the University of Nottingham. And it's based on an article that he wrote for the Economic History Review. So there's a link to that article within this blog post. So if you want to read the blog post and you find that interesting, then you can click through the link and read the article as well. One of the things he's saying is that in the medieval period, wool was the only English agricultural product with a substantial international market. At that time, English fine wool was considered the best in the world. This is prior to when Spain developed merino sheep and with their extremely fine wool. So English wool was at a peak, and apparently smuggling wool was a profitable enterprise. So if that is something that's interesting to you, it's such a different time period for me to even understand or read about this medieval period as opposed to more closer to the Industrial Revolution period. So maybe that is interesting to you as well. In the past few years, there's been a lot of talk about rejecting this idea of fast fashion and this endless cycle of new clothes constantly. And as knitters, we are probably creating some of the slowest fashion that there can be. So there is a book that was recommended to me by Bonnie. She sent me a direct message on Ravelry And she said, I'm reading a page turner of a book, thought you might be interested if you don't know about it. And I hadn't heard of it at all. The book is called Worn, A People's History of Clothing by Sophie Tannhauser. I didn't know anything about it, and I went and looked on Amazon, and there wasn't really even a blurb about it. There are a lot of little review quotes. And then I went to the publisher's page. I found a little bit more about it, and then I also found a review in The Guardian about the book. It sounds fascinating. She's talking about all different times and places and how clothing is such an important part of our human history. And there's one paragraph in the review that I thought was interesting. Worn, though, consists of much more than a string of entertaining anecdotes about people raiding the dressing up box and embarrassing themselves in the process. Its starting point is the terrible state of our current clothing industry, which, as Tannhauser describes it, exists in a nightmare wasteland of overproduction, toxic waste, choked rivers, child labor, and collapsing factories. Following 5 threads, linen, cotton, silk, rayon, and wool, she sets out to chart a deft course through material history, arguing that there is, quote, scarcely a part of the human experience, historic or current, that the story of clothes does not touch. I'm going to leave a few links down below about this one. I'll leave an Amazon link to the book, but I will also leave a link to the publisher site where you can read the Q&A from the author, and then I'll leave a link to the Guardian review, which gives you a little bit more insight into what the book is about. So if that's something of interest, you could get a copy of it or get it from the library or some other source. But I do think it's a topic that's really been more and more under discussion in the past few years. It's Finish It February, which I've been talking about since the beginning of January, and which is an opportunity to reduce your UFO pile. So if you haven't seen the videos on how to go through your UFO pile and kind of evaluate things and figure out what's going to go, what's going to stay, and then how to go about working on things in your UFO pile so that you can finish them without feeling like you're punishing yourself and depriving yourself of starting new projects, you might be interested in those videos, which I did a segment in each of the January Casual Friday episodes. I will leave links down below. So my projects for Finish It February were to re-knit 2 sleeves on my vintage 1960s sweater project. I had knit both sleeves like the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. There were gauge issues throughout, and I was really unhappy with them. They didn't fit well in the armhole, and so they needed to be re-knit, and I was not willing to do that at that time, and so I put it to the side, knowing that I would address it in February. So I started off the month knitting the first sleeve of that sweater, and then I knew I wanted to take a break from that. I planned it out that way so that I would try to keep things as fun as I can for myself in February and keep myself interested and motivated in what I'm doing. So in between the 2 sweater sleeves, my plan was to knit the second sock of a pair of knee socks. And I also wanted to add elbow patches to the sweater that I am wearing. So I often use Finish It February as Fix It February as well. Those little things where I really ought to do this. I really ought to sew the buttons on. I really ought to weave in the ends of that. I really ought to put the elbow patches on this sweater that I've been meaning to do for over a year. And so I just, that is what I do in February. I did knit the second sock of the pair. I talked a little bit about this last week. I think that was in progress. I was talking about the foot. I really like knitting socks with self-striping yarn. I really like my socks to match. If I really, really want them to match, I know that knitting them cuff down is the way for me to do that, because I can vary the length of the leg by a round or 2 in order to make sure I'm ending at exactly the same point before I start the heel, because the leg is an open tube. And so if it's a little longer or shorter, first of all, no one's going to see that or notice the difference, and I'm not probably going to notice it as I'm wearing it. But visually, I will notice that something is off if I don't have that matching up exactly at the heels. And then again, by the time you get to the toes, things might be off a little bit again. But I really want that transition from the leg to the foot to look the same on both socks. That's just my own personal quirk. Not everybody cares. Some people have completely mismatched socks and they love it and they're never bothered by something like this. But this is something that I strive to do. And last year I was striving to learn to not hate toe up sock knitting because I do prefer cuff down. But one of the things I decided I wanted to do for these knee socks and in really understanding the structure was to knit them toe up so that I could make sure that the shaping was hitting the places on the legs that I wanted it to hit as I was knitting them. And also, if I wanted to control the amount of yarn that I was using in the sock, I could potentially do that. So for the first sock, I did stop when I'd hit 50% of the ball, and it was a full-length knee sock, but it didn't stay up as well as I would like. And so then I extended the cuff. I went back and joined the yarn where I'd left off, and I knit the cuff to be twice as long so that when it would fold over, it would create a firmer fit, and that kept the sock up. And that was when I decided I do want to knit a second sock, but I'd use more than half the yarn, so I would need more yarn. So I bought a second ball of yarn, and I did try to make them match as well as I could. They're not perfect, but again, I don't care that much. You know, they're not that bad. They're pretty close, and most of the time I'm just going to be wearing them at home up here in my office, and nobody's going to say anything, so it doesn't matter. But I think for me, I have really come to the conclusion that if I'm going to knit toe-up sock, I'm going to do that in a situation where I'm knitting a stitch pattern rather than self-striping yarns, because that really does bug me at that transition if things aren't lined up perfectly. And because the foot is a closed tube at each end, you really need it to be a very specific length. You can't kind of fudge the length of it the way you can with the leg of a sock. In my opinion, you might feel differently. That probably means I won't do tons of toe-up socks in the future because I do tend to prefer knitting with self-striping yarn. I do find knitting toe-up socks to be just fine. I don't have a problem with them, except when it comes to getting those stripes to match. So I am happy with these. And I wore them all day, and then I even wore them to bed because I like to wear socks at night. And when I woke up the next morning, they were still up and around right under my knees. They hadn't slid down. So to me, that is a perfect knee sock for me and my legs. Not everybody who is participating in Finish It February is actually working on finishing projects. Some people are working on fixing projects. And that's something that I often do. And during Finish It February, I have at least one project, sometimes two, that I want to either enhance or repair or fix in some way. So this is an ideal example of a sweater that has been fixed or enhanced several times over the years. And this year, I decided to add another enhancement or fix to this sweater. And that was to put elbow patches on the sweater. The reason I did this is because I have a habit when I sit at my desk of putting my left elbow on the armrest. And I kind of have it anchored there when I'm knitting. And this arm kind of moves back and forth a little bit. I also lean on it when I'm looking at the internet. So it's not a habit that I am really interested in trying to break. But it is a habit that I need to compensate for. So this elbow had worn kind of thin. I did do some reinforcement with some sock yarn that had some nylon in it, but I really wanted to cover it up and protect it going forward. So I decided to put on these elbow patches, and I've been talking about doing this probably for a year, and I finally did it this week. So I'm going to go to the overhead and kind of talk through some of the choices that I made, that I had, and then that I made in the process of putting on these elbow patches. So this is my red Aran sweater that I knit around 2005 to 2007. I did it over the course of a few different winters. I worked on it. You've seen me make changes or fixes to this sweater a couple of times in the past year. I corrected a tiny miscrossed cable right here, and I did a video on how you can fix a miscrossed cable using duplicate stitch, which I'll link to above, but also down in the show notes. And then I reknit the neck. The reason I waited so long to do these fixes was because by the time I got to the point where I felt like I had the skill level to do them and really the desire to do them, I didn't have any more of the yarn. And so last year when I was reorganizing a closet, I found a bag full of leftover worsted weight, balls of worsted weight yarn, and the leftovers of this sweater were in there. So I had the yarn then in order to make the change to this neck. I wanted it to be deeper to fill in the neck hole more because I always felt it was too shallow. The ribbing was too shallow and the neck opening was too wide for what I like in my sweaters. I wear this sweater enough that I was wearing thin the elbow in my left elbow. And so I wanted to put these elbow patches on. So I talked to you last week about how I had originally intended to use suede. And then when I was looking at tutorials about how to approach this, the tutorial mentioned real suede patches would mean that you'd have to take the sweater to the dry cleaner anytime you want it clean, and I don't want to do that. I like to hand wash my wool sweaters. I don't want to have to take them to a dry cleaner. So I tracked down some fake suede elbow patches that are very similar to these. The color, of course, is a little different. These have these holes punched in them. And these elbow patches did as well. Even though this is fabric, they did have these holes punched in them, so which is a nice guide for sewing them on. So I had to make a decision about how I was going to place this, and the decisions you make, like the choice of techniques that you make in any situation in knitting, is going to vary from knitter to knitter, but also from project to project. So if this was a purely stockinette sweater, I may have chosen to put the patches on, place them a little bit differently than what I did with this sweater. So what I have, I have a seam line right here, and you'll notice that I did not line this up so that this edge was parallel with the seam line. I have another line, a very strong vertical line, which is this cable that runs down the middle of the sleeve. And so I had a choice. I could line up the long edge of this patch so that it was more or less parallel to this vertical line. I could line it up so that it was parallel to the seam line, or I could do something in between. And I looked at where the wear point was on the elbow. And so based on that, I decided to keep this closer to this vertical edge of the cable rather than centering it or keeping it in line with the seam. And that was just because I could see where the wear was and I wanted to do that. So I had three choices. I made a choice. And it may not be the choice that you would make, but I think it works really well for me and the particular situation that I am dealing with. Another choice that I had was what I was going to use to sew the patch on with. So the patch is a different color than the yarn. So did I want to try to match the thread to the patch? Did I want it to contrast with the patch but match with the sleeve? Or did I want to do a third option which would contrast with both of them? And I wasn't really sure which way I wanted to go. The tutorial that I found, this Professor Pincushion, she was using sewing thread, but again, she's a sewing channel and she was applying these to like commercially knit sweaters, and it probably just made sense to her to do it that way. I prefer to not use standard sewing thread when I am sewing something that doesn't stretch onto knitted fabric. So if I'm sewing something woven onto a knitted fabric, like if I'm sewing a grosgrain ribbon onto the inside of a sweater, oftentimes what I will use is something called woolly nylon. So here's an example of woolly nylon. It's a type of thread that's meant to be used in sergers when you are sewing knit fabrics. So it's meant to stretch and not cut into the fabric. So it's got give to it. So this is the kind of thing that I might use to sew grosgrain ribbon onto a sweater or something like that. So I was considering, possibly using something like this. I didn't happen to have any colors here at home that matched it, and I also thought it might be a little bit thin for what I really wanted. What I decided to do instead was I had some fingering weight yarn that I use to knit contrast heels sometimes. So it's a 4-ply fingering weight yarn, and this is a little bit thicker, quite a bit thicker than what I would really want to use for sewing on a patch. So I split the plies. It has 4 plies. And so I divided it so that I had 2 plies, and I separated out, a length of it. And so then I had two 2-ply strands. And that's what I used for sewing this on. And I think it worked really well. And I think the color, it's a little bit darker than the patch. I always prefer if you can't match, it's really difficult sometimes to get an exact match with thread, that you go a little bit darker, and I think that that worked really well for this. So I also needed to choose what kind of tool. So I picked a nice sharp needle that's kind of thick. It's a tapestry needle, and it's got an eye that's large enough for the yarn, but it is thick. So Professor Pincushion was using regular sewing thread and a regular sewing needle, and she didn't have holes punched into her patches, and she was coming in very close to the edge, maybe 1/8 of an inch in from the edge, with her standard sewing needle, which went through the fabric very easily. So the holes that were punched in here are a little bit further away, maybe 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. And I'm really glad I had those holes. First of all, the thicker yarn, I think, is well suited for a wider stitch. But also having those holes in there really helped get this needle through. So when I brought it up right into one of those holes, the needle came through right away. Sometimes I couldn't see the hole exactly where it was, and I was poking in the wrong place. And it was a lot harder to get it to come through the fabric. So I really liked having these pre-punched holes in there, and I liked the distance away they were. I liked the weight of the thread I got from splitting a 4-ply fingering weight yarn. And then the other thing that I used, which is Professor Pincushion had recommended, was when I was sewing this on, I used my darning egg, and just to keep something, to keep the 2 layers of the sleeve separated from each other. So I just had a surface underneath here. When I put the needle under it, it would hit the egg, and then I could come up. So that worked really well. It was actually the first time I was able to use this darning egg. This is an antique that I got, I think, off eBay or something. So it's probably 120 years old, something like that. So I was really happy to be able to use that for this. So again, these probably aren't perfectly sewn on. It was my first time doing it, but I did a good enough job that I'm happy with it, and I like the placement of the patches relative to my elbows when I'm wearing this. So all in all, I'm happy enough with what I did here. If you are interested in putting elbow patches on some of your sweaters, you might think about some of the options that I talked about. But you might also be interested in the tutorial that I watched that helped me get started, just in seeing the potential for some other options other than what I had originally thought of. But also, if you want to see how to do the type of stitch, which is called a blanket stitch, that I used to go around the circumference of the suede patches. I'll leave a link to that tutorial down below. So as I've gotten back to work on my 1960s vintage sweater, I've had a couple of questions regarding the skirt that I was planning to knit to match the sweater. When I knit vintage sweaters, they are part of this long-term project I'm working on to knit a sweater from each decade, from the 1890s to the 1990s. Just about this time last year, I discovered that in the 1960s and into the 70s, there were these sweater kits that were really popular that would include a pattern and the yarn to make the sweater, and then a coordinating skirt length of wool fabric. So it wasn't a new thing for a store to sell yarn with coordinating wool fabric. That I could find ads in newspapers going back to like the 1930s or 40s, where a department store would have its fabric department, and they would advertise that they have all of this wool yarn with coordinating wool fabric. So you could just buy them separately. But in the 60s, they came out with these kits. So I bought a few off eBay. This one included 2 patterns in it. I think it was typical to have one, and maybe somebody had bought a couple of these kits at one time and used one of the kits, and there were just the 2 patterns got stuck in here. I don't know. But there were 2 patterns in this kit. I didn't particularly like this color of yarn. That's not a color I would wear. But the other thing that comes in here, you can see that there are matching buttons and grosgrain ribbon. And so I just loved the idea of that because I was working on this vintage project. And so I actually bought a couple of kits. I bought this one, which was by Andrew Stewart. And then I bought this one, which is also Andrew Stewart. This one only had 5 of the 8 balls of yarn in it, and the pattern was missing. But what it had was a picture of the weaver who had woven this fabric. So this is a hand-woven tweed wool fabric from like Scotland, that area, the border counties they call it. So this is just like a thrill to me. So this one didn't have a pattern. It didn't have enough yarn. I liked the color better. I love the fact that the weaver was in there. Then I bought a third vintage kit that was from a different company, and it was from Isle of Bute. And they still exist, but they make upholstery fabrics these days. They aren't making yarn, and they aren't making hand-woven fabric as they did back in the day. The Isle of Bute yarn is the one that I really like. So that's this sweater right here. This is the body of the sweater. I don't have the sleeves in it yet. But this is that color. And then the fabric that came with it was this fabric. So when I bought this kit, I thought, okay, I definitely want to make the skirt to go with this sweater. I don't know, again, I don't know that I'll ever wear them. But I do want to make things that fit me, and in case I decide I like them. But I just want this, like, it's part of this project to really understand the evolution of hand knit sweaters in this 110-year time period. I really thought this was something that was so popular, and I really wanted to do this. I wanted to sew this, but it's a limited amount of fabric, and I can't mess up, and I want it to look nice. So I took out my sewing machine, which I've had since I was in college. It's a completely mechanical sewing machine that my mom and I bought at one of the big box stores with Joann Fabrics, and so it was their store brand. It was, the same as just about every other mechanical machine. It served me well. I made some clothes before I went to live overseas when I was in college. And then when I had kids, I would make their Halloween costumes with it every year. So it was a machine that I used to make things that weren't like serious clothing. Like I just didn't know enough about garment making. And I decided, there's so many videos and things available now. There's so much more knowledge out there about how to do things that I could learn how to sew better. And so I started watching craftsy videos, and I was practicing learning how to draft my own skirt pattern. And one of the things I realized along the way was that I was going to have to match this plaid. It shouldn't be super hard, but I was going to have to match it. So it was just one more piece of stress on me in terms of getting this skirt to come out. And so I worked on sewing for a few months, and then I started getting back into spinning for a few months, and now I haven't been doing either one of them. So I do want to finish my spinning project, but I also want to get back to sewing so that I can make the skirt, because I am getting close to finishing the sweater. So I have a big birthday coming up next month. I have been thinking about what I wanted to buy myself for my birthday. And I could think of 3 big ticket items that I would want that would live in this room. and so it's going to be a sewing machine. I've got some things I have to accomplish before I allow myself to buy it, but I really do want to buy a sewing machine that just makes the sewing a little more fun than work. There's always so much work involved in getting the result that I want from my mechanical machine. I haven't completely decided on exactly what model I'm going to get, but it's probably going to be a Janome. And I'm hoping then that there's certain things that I've kind of struggled with based on my old machine that I'm hoping will make things easier and help me be more confident in my sewing. So for those of you who asked, what's going to happen with the skirt, it is going to happen. It might be a couple of months before it does happen. I've got some practice fabric that is also, it's a close type of plaid in terms of having those squares that would line up that I'm going to be able to practice with. I have to pull out my drafted skirt pattern and do some practice on that, and then I will cut into this precious fabric. So I just want to let you know, because a number of you have asked about this skirt project that goes along with the sweater project. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not already subscribed, please consider doing so. And if you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.